Thank you, Stephen. This is Brianne. We are getting into the last session of today, so I appreciate everyone joining us again after lunch. Today we'll be covering, in this session, wildlife and a whole host of the other topics that Tony will be covering after me. You have already had a chance to hear the forestry talk that used to be lumped in with us, but we've since spaced out the wealth of information. So we're going to dive right in today. And since it has been certainly more than a minute since Monday afternoon when we went over the wildlife resource concerns, I wanted to take a few moments to see if there were any questions from Monday. And if you don't have any, I'm going to ask a few of my own. So did anyone have any follow-up questions after Monday? Okay, so for the next few minutes before we dive into today's topic, I want to ask a few follow-up questions from Monday that'll give us some ideas of where we stand with the resource concern in our knowledge, anything we might have to additionally cover today, and just hopefully jog our memory to get us in the right mindset for the rest of the discussion as we start talking about the field conditions for the WEG. So I'm going to start off. Feel free to unmute yourself and answer, or you can type the answers in the chat. Multiple people answer. Sometimes there are multiple answers, but our first question for today is, in Indiana, can you use both the national or the WEG questions in CART? When using CART, can we use either or the WEG questions or the national questions? Which is it? Got a vote for the WEG. Anyone have anything different? Two votes for the WEG, and that is correct. So in Indiana, when we're addressing the terrestrial wildlife resource concern in CART, we will only use the WEG score that we conduct using either our land use WEGs or the working lands for wildlife WEGs, which would, in our case, would be either the bobwhite for grasslands or the monarch. And the reason for this is when those terrestrial WEGs or terrestrial national questions were developed, they were developed to encompass an incredible range of habitats across the nation. So whether you're in Maine, you're in Texas, you're in North Dakota, you're in Utah or Arizona, those questions are the same, and they didn't necessarily fit well with habitats in the Midwest. Some of them are a little more challenging to answer. Some of them just in general really didn't help us assess the habitat the way we would manage it here in Indiana. So we will be using the land use WEGs, and then you would just need to select the appropriate score to put into CART. Now, how about for the SFAP2 for aquatic habitat? Would you use the national questions or the SFAP2? Any thoughts on that one when we got into the aquatic habitat side of things? No, we don't often think about this because we don't do a lot of in work. But so for the SFAP2, you actually do not need to conduct an entire SFAP2 if you're addressing aquatic habitat needs. There are several elements, and we went over those Monday afternoon, the information related to the national questions and which of the elements in SFAP2 correspond to each other is in not only that presentation, but as well as the wildlife supplement to CART. If we were to do If you were to do the whole SFAP 2, that's great. It addresses multiple resource concerns even beyond habitat, and it certainly can be done if you're in a situation to do that. But if you don't, it can still be a good resource to know how to answer the questions for the aquatic resource concern, particularly for the stream side of that. So that is not required. SFAP 2 is a national tool. It works pretty well in most aquatic situations across the country, but only a limited number of the elements are needed for the habitat side of that. So when you're using either of these tools, what are the 4 elements of habitat being evaluated? This is a trip back to our elementary school days and meeting our own basic needs. What are the 4 habitat elements being evaluated? So we have cover, size, water, and we all just filled the last one. Yep, food. So food, water, space, connectivity, space, size, those all fit into that space and connectivity. So not only how big is that area, but can something move from one area to another? That is obviously different depending on the species out there, but those 4 habitat elements are critical whether you're in an aquatic system or a terrestrial system. And the reason, as we went over on Monday, that we don't have separate resource concerns for each of these anymore, they used to be sub-concerns just under habitat, is that in the end, we're going to treat them all pretty similarly. Whether you need food or cover on site, or if you have cover but you need maybe a more diverse range of food species in terms of plants on the site, it still ends up being a planting. I mean, that what you plant changes, but that's not necessarily going to affect which practice you put in. So having them divided by terrestrial and aquatic allows us to really target the specific species that exist in both of those, and the fact that how you would get food and water or space and connectivity into an aquatic habitat is certainly different than on a terrestrial habitat, but it allows that within those that they can just all be addressed very similarly. So one of the things we covered on Monday was when evaluating those 4 elements, we look at a bunch of different factors out on site. And some of those factors are part of the primary habitat suitability index or the footprint of the habitat. And some factors are related to the landscape habitat suitability index score, which really looks at the whole landscape's impact on the habitat. So I'm going to list a couple examples of some of the factors you might be evaluating in the WEGs, and you tell me if it's the PHSI or the LHSI. So when we're looking at the species richness, would that be in the primary or landscape score? Species richness being the number of species out there. Is that primary or landscape? And we're talking plant species, not wildlife. Any thoughts on that?
Primary.
Primary. Thank you, Chris. So primary, and that's correct. So that is in the footprint of what the habitat is. So whether you're planting it or whether you're evaluating what exists there, you're looking at that footprint of the habitat. What if you're evaluating if the landowner is using IPM? So integrated pest management, what would that be? What would that fall under? So
Okay,
IPM, oh, go ahead, Chris.
I'll chime in again. Not primary, but I don't have the score sheet in front of me to know what the name of the other one is.
It's the landscape. Landscape, you're correct. So the IPM, or however they're spraying or treating the adjacent fields, is adjacent to it. So while it's not necessarily happening on the habitat itself, although we know there's instances of herbicide use and that may be happening in the habitat, particularly when we look at like insecticide use or fungicide use, we are curious as to how that may drift onto our habitat, any of the potential water quality issues that could impact our habitat, but typically that is not taking place immediately on the habitat. So again, when we're looking at the landscape scores, that's something that is what's outside the habitat we're immediately involved with, and how is that influencing it. So another item you might be counting, if particularly in wooded situations, or how many snags are there. So what would snags be, primary or landscape? Landscape. It might seem logical because we're in a woods and it's not always necessarily the footprint we're looking at, but snags are usually something we're looking at in the footprint of whatever habitat we're managing. So we're going to be counting how many snags are occurring in a particular woodlot that maybe we're going to do some forest stand improvement in, especially if it's for wildlife. We always want to leave a few snags in there. If you're doing some specific bat management, that would be the same thing there too. So snags, again, are counting in that footprint. Now this one is a little more tricky, but hydrology. What would hydrology be, landscape or primary? Well, congratulations. You guys are the group that got this one right. It is the primary because we are looking at the hydrology that's in the habitat we are influencing. So although hydrology can be influenced by the landscape, and obviously is in many cases, especially when you're in river watersheds or stream watersheds that might be impacting the hydrology on your site, we want to know for the habitat purposes what's going on in the footprint that we're managing. Okay, and last one, cover crops and tillage, what would that be? Landscape. So that is definitely correct. Although we know wildlife is using cover crops, how we till the field has a big impact on wildlife usage of it, between the use of the waste grain to even some cover. That and the cover crops, so many of the species that we use or see farmers using in cover crops are the same species that are sold probably at a much higher cost in a deer food plot mix. Those are not the places that those species are existing on a permanent basis. They're going out there, they're using them, and they're going back to the habitat. So that's a landscape influence. It does provide food. It's, again, bonus points essentially to the habitat, but it's not the habitat itself. All right, and this is truly the last question. Where are the WEGs stored? FOTG3. And I am gonna go ahead and pull this up. So yes, if you are in search of the WEG, is in search of the WEGs, of course, Indiana, Section 3, the Wildlife Habitat Evaluation Guides. The 2021 guide has been uploaded. There are, last year's are still there in case you need it for some of the CSP that had some carryover, and then all of the modules have links on there as well. Okay, with that, I'm going to go ahead and start the presentation. Please let me know if you cannot hear it. Hello.
Can't hear
Today,
it.
I will images and photos that relate to the different in-field scenarios you may encounter when conducting a WEG review. I have not included SFAP2 components to this discussion. Images of different on-site conditions for streams, stream bank, and riparian areas are covered in the webinar included in the prerequisites. Because we do not often become involved in stream restoration here in Indiana, I want to spend our limited time today focused on terrestrial habitat. Hopefully, what we cover today will give you the confidence to either use the WEG yourself or to interpret the WEG you receive from a partner biologist. As a reminder, there are modules for each of the habitat types shown on the screen. These modules focused on the workings of the WEG tool itself. I encourage you to watch them to gain a more in-depth understanding. Today, we will focus more on the actual on-site habitat conditions and how to qualitatively assess habitat factors. Because we are unable to go to the field and look at these sites directly, we are going to take a look at some photos of typical situations and discuss how these would be evaluated in the WEG too. Let us start with the simplest scenario. This first field is pretty familiar to many of us in the state. Row crop agriculture with little to no cover. And as we know, it looks a little something like this. A small roadside margin of grass, maybe, and no cover to speak of. A rapid assessment option is available in these instances where the current site characteristics are clearly not very suitable for wildlife. It is likely a field visit or an additional field visit is not going to be needed in this instance. It is pretty obvious that the current rating is poor, and the planned rating, if the minimum habitat to be installed occurs, will be good. Without a more detailed analysis, there is no way to rapidly assess if the site is going to meet excellent conditions. Excellent would require the installation above and beyond standard minimums and an assessment of the surrounding landscape conditions. Keep in mind, this rapid assessment is also available for use in monotypic grass areas such as fescue pastures, areas with extremely low diversity, or that are overgrazed. In these situations, a field visit is required, but a quick walkthrough will reveal these conditions pretty well and without a need for more. Taking the cover up a little, the next situation we often encounter includes an actively cropped field coupled with a fence row or narrow grass buffer, or uncropped odd area. In scenarios like this one, there is planner discretion in what is assessed. Is the existing vegetation under the control of the landowner or tenant? Will it be managed the same? Will any additional habitat be additive? The planner, along with the landowner, decides whether to include the existing habitat in the assessment or not. This is an instance where there may actually be a change in the space size factors shown here from something other than a starting point of 0. And the plan condition may look something like this. The landowner may want to add an additional field border that connects the existing fence row at the north end to the farmstead and odd area in the south end. This increases the total acreage, but not the width. The habitat to the east is not under the control of the landowner, so is not included in the assessment. If the proposed field border was added to the brushy field edge to the north, it would be additive by increasing both the width and the acreage. And of course, there are whole field situations where the entire field may be in perennial vegetative habitat. These include old field scenarios, CRP re-enrollments, or old equip habitat plantings. Note at this time we are encouraging but not requiring of the WEG for CRP re-enrolls. The WEG may be beneficial in terms of helping identify habitat needs and practices to achieve those needs, but it is not mandatory. When deciding which associated land use WEG to use, it is important to talk with the landowner to determine their habitat goals, the level of management they are interested and capable of doing, and what the site can support. A landowner that is not interested in the high level of management necessary to maintain a grassland system may be better off pursuing woody habitat. In another instance, the landowner may want to remove the invasive brush or silver maple saplings to plant high quality herbaceous habitat. As a reminder, the WAG is qualitative. Unless you are completing a working lands for wildlife WAG, there is no need to use plots or transects. Walk the area of interest and do a generalized assessment. Break the habitat down further if needed due to distinct habitat types, but do not worry if there is heterogeneity in the stand. An area dominated by Indian grass next to an area of little bluestem and forbs doesn't need to necessarily be separated. Heterogeneity is a good thing and better than a uniform stand of just one of those pockets. In this example, on this slide, it's a whole field herbaceous habitat. All of the WEGs, no matter what habitat type we're talking about, include a factor on species richness. The more species present, the more stable the ecosystem. It will support a wider range of insects, which in turn will support a wide range of vertebrates. More species can also help fill in microhabitats on the site, preventing invasive species from moving in. So how to assess this? If you are not a botanist, do not stress. It is important you learn the key species we typically work with in NRCS, such as Indian grass, big bluestem, little bluestem, black-eyed Susan, purple coneflower, etc. It is good to learn these in the winter months as well, but don't stress about which aster you have or the species of goldenrod. These may be critical for some species, particularly invertebrates, but for the land use based WEGs, they serve the same function. So in these images, we have the minimum of two grasses, Indian grass and big bluestem. We also have gray-headed coneflower, a goldenrod, black-eyed Susan, and an aster. Note that I am not separating out for the purpose of this assessment which aster or goldenrod we have. We are lacking a fifth forb to meet the standard minimum, as well as a native perennial legume, so an interseeding is warranted. There is also Ceresia lespedeza, which does not count towards the diversity, but would warrant invasive control. The percentage cover of Ceresia would be included in the invasive factor. Because habitat being managed for trees is different than herbaceous habitat, and small wooded draws, fence rows, woodlots are not managed the same as forest, associated agland wooded WEG is available. And what these look like can be quite variable. Open fields that will have small tree plantings or existing tree plantings that have not reached canopy cover fall into this category. Even mature areas that are too small to manage as a forest may fit well into this WEG. As you are looking at these sites, you are looking at a future potential. What types of mass species are there? How diverse are the seedlings and saplings and other young trees? What types of management can occur to assist with getting the site to the end condition? Questions in this WEG are a combination of herbaceous and forest habitat. And just as in herbaceous, it starts with a look at what is the overall composition of the site. Similar to herbaceous habitat, you will be looking at species richness, particularly of the trees. In a natural regeneration situation, it is not uncommon for there to only be a handful of species, cottonwood, silver maple, historically ash, although less so now. To increase diversity, supplemental planting may be needed. Forest land habitat was not included in the first round of WEGs, but was released later in the year. There currently is no recorded module for forest land WEGs, but I can add one if that is necessary. When using the wildlife ranking pools to fund forest land projects, the WEG must be run. Not all forest management is completed with wildlife in mind, so it is important that if a portion of the 10% of funds for wildlife is being used in forestry practices, they will address critical wildlife resource concerns. When looking at forest habitat, one of the key components that will be reviewed is the forest age structure. This provides information on the next generation of trees and is influenced by a number of factors, including prescribed burning and grazing management. The picture on the left shows a woods that was grazed probably 15 years ago or more. If I were to speculate, it probably was used as a winter shelter. Notice, due to the soil compaction, tree health, and just overall poor site conditions, there is very little regeneration. Compare this to the site on the right, where there are overstory, midstory, and understory trees and seedlings. Now, of course, the species makeup of these layers must be taken into consideration too, but knowing there is a next generation of trees is important. In addition to structural diversity in a specific location, we also want to see structural diversity across the forest. Percentage of young forest gets at the needs of different forest wildlife species by providing different cover types from mature woods to openings and early successional habitat, but also gets at the need to regenerate specific species, primarily food sources. Diverse forest structure increases the possibility of oak hickory regeneration, and openings are often good sources of soft mass too. Diverse food sources are very critical to forest wildlife. The example in this image is how to determine the hard mass component. Hard mass is durable, it can be stored, it is high in fat and protein. It is the food source that gets animals through the winter. At least 20% of the forest should be hard mass species. No plots, no prisms, just estimate. Count 5 trees, at least one hard mast. The blue lines indicate hard mass trees in this example. Once you count the 5 trees and how many are hard mass, do it again. Take an average of these counts and determine that if at least 20% of the forest is likely hard mass trees. And then it is time to assess how many of those trees are different species. More species means less likely that there will be a complete crop failure in any given year. In this example, there is more than 20% hard mass, and it is made up of 3 to 4 different species of trees. Soft mast, as mentioned earlier, is also critically important. These are quick fruits, often spring and early summer food. Early successional, first to colonize an opening, great for sugars and some fats and proteins as well. They also tend to be some of the better pollinator nectar and pollen sources. Remember, nectar is the sugar and pollen is the protein for many insects. Because they can be vast in coverage and variable in individual stems versus the aerial coverage of the plant, this measure just looks at the species richness. Examples shown here include blackberry on the left, but also include trees such as hackberry, black cherry, sassafras, and of course grapevine. Structures that provide shelter, escape cover, nesting habitat, etc. are included in all of the land use regs. What is a structure in the land use may vary though. And note that sometimes these are not obvious. The small live cavity hole in the left can provide a chickadee nest, a snake den, a rodent den. Larger cavities and snags in the center often are carved out by woodpeckers and are nesting cavities for larger birds such as owls, potentially mammals as well. And the brush pile seen here is not particularly large, but it did provide nesting cover for several litters of cottontail this past summer. It also provides downed wood to support salamander and reptiles. And finally, wetlands. One current inconsistency in CART is the treatment of wetland habitat. Assessment questions for wetland habitat show up under aquatic habitat, but can only be triggered if there is a water feature modifier. But we rarely work in existing wetlands. We primarily restore wetlands, so there is no current water feature. So let's take a look at an example. The majority of wetlands we look at look like this. In this photo, you can see a wet spot in the field and what looks like a drainage away from the wetland. The wetland WEG asks only two questions. One, what is the hydrology? And two, what is the score from the appropriate land use WEG for vegetation? This example is like the photo on the left that is a wet depression in a row crop field with no perennial vegetation. To address this in CART, use the wetland land use WEG under terrestrial habitat and proceed with the WEG score as with the other land uses. If there is an ephemeral, seasonal, or temporary wetland that dries up, consider doing the same. If it is a permanent wetland, such as the image on the right, it is acceptable to use the aquatic habitat CART questions, as there is permanent water present.
Hello?
But you can also use the wetland WEG if you want a more in-depth analysis of the surrounding buffer. This discrepancy in the resource concern has been elevated to the CART team. That was a lot to cover in a short period of time. Please do not hesitate to ask questions. And also, please reach out to your planning team leads and RMSs if you would like to have in-field trainings for even closer looks at these topics. So hopefully that presentation made the WEG a little less intimidating. Are there any questions? If not, I have my own set again, so this is your chance to fill up the time so I don't ask mine. One thing I do want to note is that I didn't mention in the presentation is that the forest WEG was very intentionally developed with factors that should be able to be pulled from a forest management or stewardship plan, or if they are not in there, there are reasonable questions that you could ask a forester to get the answers for. Some of them, obviously, like grazing management, you would be talking to the landowner about, but when Brian Cruz assisted with the development of that one, we really tried to make sure that it was something that if you aren't the one evaluating the forest, that it could be pulled from the appropriate plan. So keep that in mind as you're looking at that, and don't be intimidated about the forestry WEG itself. Okay, well, with hearing no questions from the group, I'm going to ask a couple quick questions before handing it over to Tony. So with the WEGs, do any require transects to be completed? Do any WEGs require transects? Yes, and oh, go ahead, Chris. I hear you.
I was going to say no.
None of the land use WEGs do, but there are a limited number, primarily the monarch WEG, that does in fact require a transect. And the reason the monarch WEG is different, and if there would ever be any other working lands for wildlife type WEGs implemented, is they have one very specific need. So we're really looking at the milkweed and the nectaring plants. So we do need an actual quantitative number with those. The other part that comes along with the monarch is that there is an agreement with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in terms of what we're measuring and how we can account for the habitat we're putting out there that can actually influence the listing decision. That's actually going to be made later this month. We'll see how that turns out. But then even after whatever the decision is there, how we interact with U.S. Fish and Wildlife in terms of that species. Can you achieve an excellent planned condition using a rapid assessment? No, correct. So to get to an excellent, you really need a more detailed assessment, particularly of the planned condition. And the reason for that is that really excellence looking at how far above and beyond you're going from the planned minimum. So we know that you can use a rapid assessment when there's no habitat out there. Even if you were to have to switch to one of the land use WEGs, doing the benchmark condition should be really easy. They're gonna score 0, right? But if you can start assessing how you're going to put out there, what density, are you incorporating management into that? That really lets you and the landowner see how far that habitat can go, and that also influences the ranking score if it's involved in one of our financial assistance programs where excellent condition can actually achieve some ranking points. So if we're going to bump something up in a ranking system, we want to make sure that it is achieving a higher level of management and habitat out there. Why is hard mast important? Why do we care about hard mast, whether in a associated ag wooded area or in a forest? What does hard mast do? Lasts all winter, high protein, important food source that lasts, and that is critical. So there's always a lot of emphasis in wildlife management plans on that hard mast because it is the storage food. For anything that is eating nuts and grains, that hard mast is what's getting them through the winter. We don't necessarily see a lot about soft mast, but soft mast as the quick food, the sugar is also important. It tends to come in on its own pretty well, so we don't always have to plant it. Sometimes we do just to get it there quicker. If you're starting with nothing, I always encourage the inclusion of something that might have some soft mast in it because it does provide some really quick and very nutritious high energy foods. So a hedgerow, incorporated into a planting can be a good thing. The other thing to keep in mind with a lot of the soft mast species, and the image in the presentation showed blackberry, black raspberry would be another one, is the cover those provide. And some of the shrubs that would also include those berries are also very dense. They can be thorny, and species that not only eat them really benefit from the cover and the protection that those offer. So whether it's a little wild plum hedgerow or those blackberry and black raspberries, think about how much you don't want to walk through them and then realize for the little creatures and wildlife living underneath them, they're hiding under there because coyotes and fox and other predators are also less inclined to want to try to navigate through that. So that's one of the other benefits of soft mast in addition to the food that it provides. With that, is there any other questions for the wildlife portion of this afternoon? Definitely don't hesitate to reach out, and I'm going to pass the speaker over to Tony.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks a bunch, Brianne. Always appreciate a little discussion on protein and sugars, two of my favorite food groups. Don't usually think of them as hard mass, though. But anyways, so my name is Tony Bailey. Middle name this afternoon will be Smorgasbord. Talking about a variety of different topics related to resource concerns. As I transition to my slides, I'd like to take a quick minute to stand up in place and stretch. Please do so. All right. Stephen, are you able to see my lead slide?
Yep, it's there.
Awesome. All right. So like I mentioned, we talked a little bit about resource concerns, conservation planning related to and cropland. And we'll talk a little bit about CARD as well, sprinkle a little bit of that in. Not sure how much we've provided guidance on a couple of these topics in the past, particularly related to the farmstead, but we'll touch on these a little bit more as we move along this afternoon. So I think it's probably been covered in several other sessions now, since you are the last group on the last session here for Thursday. We already talked a little bit about erosion, I think, during the soil health and also during pasture. A little bit at the beginning. This is a topic where it's more common, familiar to us, resource concern. Shouldn't have any real questions about this, but when we start thinking about it related to a farmstead, we can see in this picture how a farmstead likely contributed to additional erosion, gullies from the runoff from that operation. We can see how it's impacted that crop field, but likely, if you start looking real closely, you can see that some of those gullies have moved up towards the farmstead or into the farmstead. I think a little bit of a more uncommon situation, but just to think about that as we have, if we have erosion at a farmstead, more often than not, we're seeing this out in the field. So switching to another topic here, let's talk a little bit about some other items at the farmstead. So these other concerns, the petroleum, the agrochemical, the nutrients, aren't as common to us, maybe not as comfortable to us. We haven't spent as much time on them. Most of us didn't go to school to handle pollutants and that around the farmstead. But it's very important that we think about these resource concerns. We pay attention to them. All the really good things that we do out in the field, those things that I'm in favor of and biased towards, the no-till, the cover crops, sprinkling some grass waterways, filter strips and such. All those other resource concerns, the really proactive things that we're working with farmers on out there can kind of be undone by a few resource concerns from these items at the farmstead. And these items around the farmstead, can have a major impact for both the farmer and the watershed. So we just want to make sure we're keeping these in mind, even though they're a little bit out of our area that we've spent as much time in. Location, location, location. So fuel storage can happen anywhere, whether it's near housing, lakes and ponds or reservoirs, near a wellhead, along a stream or a ditch. Makes a little bit of difference if it's a little bit of an older operation. Hopefully with a newer operation, we've taken a little bit more time and planned and where we're going to put these items. That bottom right picture, a storage, looks like we've got a roof over it and we've got secondary containment, all good. But then we've placed a newer facility next to a stream or a ditch. So if we do have an issue, a problem there, unfortunately, we're much more likely to have a spill. Hopefully, something that's not catastrophic. But are these all potential resource concerns? They are, yes. But good or bad, they're not generally accounted for within CART. CART does not ask where the fuel is stored. So, but anyways, want to keep these in mind as far as resource concerns we can see at the farmstead. What about fuel spillage? Wow, this is a real big concern related to the environment. Whether it's just running down the driveway a little bit, or whether it's leaching down through the soil profile towards the well, towards the underground water. We want to make sure we're paying attention to these. We have fewer of the leaky underground storage tanks. We've been encouraging people to put these above ground. We can see what's going on with them, and that's a good thing. At the same time, we want to try and make sure that we address what's going on around there, and just that maintenance, that good housekeeping. And we get a lot of, well, what are you going to do? And it's like, well, let's try to do a little bit better. So does CART ask if fuel is spilled? No, CART doesn't care if a little or a lot was spilled, but they are, and we do want to keep these in mind and think about these at the same time. What we do want to see is secondary containment. Whether it's with a roof over it or not, we want to make sure that we've got some sort of containment around there, so that if spillage of those larger volumes happens, we've got opportunity to collect that. I would offer that I think in most cases it would be better if we left the hoses within the secondary containment. Hoses crack, hoses can break, hoses can fall off, whatever, but leaving them within the secondary containment in case something happens, hopefully we've got a higher potential of catching a larger amount of that. So this is what CART does want to see, that we have secondary containment, and we assume that if they have it, they made an attempt, document it good, and drive on. It's also important for us to consider if and how agrochemicals, the various products, are stored or handled on or at the farmstead. If if the farmer's applying nutrients or pesticides, particularly pesticides, or do their own spraying, then they're keeping products on hand and need to pay more attention to that. If they're not keeping it on hand, especially if the co-op's doing a lot of that, then this is not as big of an issue. And it's going to vary considerably by farm, and what you see on the farms will also vary considerably. So, but we want to pay attention to these a little bit. We should also assume that the farmer knows what the rules and regulations are from the Office of Indiana State Chemists related to all these storage. And then also, if they happen to have a spill, what the requirements are related to IDEM. So we hope that's occurring, and we should assume that they are. At the same time, a few things to pay attention to. So let's look at a couple of those a little closer. So to me, this is one that been challenging when they added the CART, asking about some secondary containment issues around some of these products. And so one of the things that we tried not to do was to make it for all the storage, any amounts. We tried to make it if they were just over the Office of Indiana State Chemists. So anyways, need to pay attention to the amounts, the liquid, the dry, that's being stored at the farm, on the farm. Then also related to the pesticides, and that those are also being contained, and that there are specific amounts related to those regulations. As we have farms with more commonly using mini bulk tanks, those can also fall into this as well. And then the Office of Indiana State Chemists, they've got publications, materials. This one's from May of 2016, and much easier to read format than the Indiana Administrative Code. So utilize these. Again, we'll assume that the farmers know these rules and regulations, are following them, but we might need to confirm that it's being considered and that they are addressing those and following those. Can we see resource concerns associated with storage of these products? We certainly can. Again, whether these products are being stored too close to a ditch, there may be additional setback or berms or diking around there would certainly help. I think another sign around all these storage, if we're seeing dead vegetation, whether it's broadleaves or grasses, if we have dead vegetation, that means we have escape of product. It could be that they've just sprayed in that area, but we see dead grass, or we see living grass and then nothing, no vegetation. Something's happened. Maybe they've pumped out of that secondary containment there and put that over the side, and whenever we do those sorts of things, we have potential of additional losses to the system. I've ever heard of a time where the Indiana Department of Environmental Management got involved with there was a co-op that was going through and spraying out their secondary containment and pumping that over out of the secondary containment into the ditch. And so, you guys go out and clean up in that, and I get that, but then put in the ditch, and of course they thought there was an issue related to a livestock operation upstream, and then they started exploring, and they found out that no, there was a facility that had moved some of that product over the side there. So anyways, these are resource concerns. Might not necessarily be addressed in CART, but some things for us to consider and maybe think about as we're out at the farmstead. What we do want to see out there is some sort of secondary containment system around these, whether it's roofed or not. Just a couple of these are some facilities that we've helped with around the state. And so having that secondary containment to help in case there is a leak or a failure reduces chances of spills and large cleanups and expensive things. A little bit of expense here can really save us later. So hopefully I want to make sure that we see those on the facilities. Another item is it's a little bit challenging at the farmstead, but I think this is one that we're a little bit more familiar with. Is we have an animal feeding operation, and it's whether or not those animals are confined or if they're out and about on pasture, but just how those animals are handled around the facility, around the farmstead. Do they have access to water bodies? How is the manure being handled and stored? And then what's happening with the manure that is being collected afterwards? How are we getting that applied to the field? So all these things, this manure, wastewater handling, and storage, all kind of fits together, and we want to think about it that way. Again, it's something I hope we're more familiar with, and how we work with the producers on this, but making sure that we're accounting for all of these. One of these in particular, CART, asks for the number of animals and not the animal units. At the same time, when we're out there collecting the number of animals, let's just go ahead and collect the weights and sizes, everything else, the numbers of all the different animals that are out there, so we can come up with the animal units later when we need it for the equip contract or practice design or whatever else. So just collect all that information at once, and then we have it and decrease the chances of needing to collect that again later. So I think this is one of the, I don't know, more interesting, more challenging that we have as far as when animals have access to surface water bodies. And we're going to use some slides again, and we've got a variety of slides, in-state, out-of-state. You know, some of these are slides that we've collected, been sent in by TSPs. They're, again, some are from the state, and we're not trying to embarrass anyone. It's if it's from your county or not. You know, we realize that these are challenging situations. Maybe we've tried to work with these producers for a long time, tried to work with them progressive planning, and things change and whatever, but they do give us an opportunity to look and discuss some of these things. It's also challenging when we're out on these operations. You know, we can be out there today, first part of December, and things might look pretty good out there right now, relatively speaking. Out there at the end of February, 3 months, frozen ground, maybe it's wet, you know, compaction, and a site that looked pretty good in December can look really, really bad in February. Also big difference if we're in a wet spell versus a dry spell. So, you know, a lot of these facilities, beef cattle, dairy were built, especially these older operations, were built right on the edge of a stream. I think that was part of their waste management plan at one time. I've ever seen these concentrated flow areas go through the barn, and I think that was part of their plan as part of the flush system. We don't see as many of those now. We know that we'd like to do something different with those, but you know, those facilities I really call site challenge, especially when we've got them sitting right next to a stream or a ditch. So I have to try and work with them progressively and, you know, incrementally, trying to get them to make little tweaks, little changes, and unfortunately, we still see lots of these scattered around the state. So how do we, you know, continue to work on these in a proactive manner and in our conservation planning? If you've never stopped at one, pulled in your government truck and said, "I'm from the government, I'm here to help you," I challenge you to do it. a fun experience for me in a positive way. But looking at these facilities, you know, this picture, loafing lot, you know, is the land use pasture versus farmstead. I would offer, I think it's farmstead. There's no vegetation there, so we should be looking at it as farmstead. They have access to the stream, so there's 0 cart points. This operation, pasture versus farmstead, again, I would offer that it is farmstead. You know, no vegetation. Cattle have complete access. So again, a very challenging situation. This picture here is associated with the previous one. There's fence there. The cattle, is the fence used to fence the cattle in or out of the stream? We know we can use that either way. We like to use it to our advantage and fence the cattle out, and maybe have a management plan and allow very limited access. I doubt that the ducks and geese in the front of this picture have caused all the issues here. I would assume that the cattle have been more of the problem, although getting the ducks and geese there, we do have a little bit of challenge of the nutrients and pathogens in the water. Are they strictly from the cattle? No, they're not. There's also contributions from wildlife, but we got to make sure that we're taking control of the things that we can, and taking care of the cattle in there is one thing that we can do. So making sure we're using that fence and managing that area. Another item is, do we have control or treatment of the runoff from around the facilities? Do we have gutters on the buildings? Are they open lots? Do we have berms? Does clean water come in contact with manure and potential losses of that manure as nutrients or pathogens? Doing what we can to address those. Same thing here, and I think about this long ago in a land far away when I worked in the field. You know, working with a producer, they were wanting a grass waterway, and we needed a rock chute. And we're standing there talking about the gully and where the grass waterway was going to go, and the rock chute was going to be placed. And I'm looking behind them at the stream, and behind that is the cattle operation, the feed lot, that the cattle have access to the stream. The runoff is going into the stream. And I thought it was interesting that here we were trying to address the gully and get some erosion control in there, and yet we were ignoring that other piece. And so we did work on that grass waterway and rock chute, but I also mentioned maybe there's some things to think about on the other side of the stream. And I know that even after I left and moved on out of that field office, I know they eventually did work on some of those things there. So I think it's important for us to bring those things up, even though we may not see those to fruition. Plant some seeds as part of that good resource conservation, identification of resource concerns, and good conservation planning that we should be doing. Also, you know, looking at this operation, we can see we've got some gutters on the buildings. Have this nice cleaned off pad here. Maintenance management, also very important. We can build some really nice facilities, but if they're not managed well, this was scraped just prior to this picture, but you know, it's a gray day. It doesn't look like we're going to get, you know, there's a lot of rain, at least right now, but you know, making sure that we've done what we can to manage that is going to help that operation, that facility. So making sure that we keep those items in consideration. And then being able to scrape any of that manure, you know, using the curbs off to the side and scrape it into a waste holding facility. You know, we do have control, we do have treatment of this, not leaving the site. You know, this day picture's taken, it's nice and dry, things look great. Again, if it was raining or frozen, we know they always look different at that time, but things look pretty good now, and this is what we're shooting for. Variety of ways that manure is stored and handled or not, and in this case, looks like there was a slight attempt, and we have, I don't know if you would call this leakage or just massive overflow or flow through. I'm not sure, but anyways, a lot of loss there. You know, try and make sure we get these addressed. That would not be considered storage of any sort that we're looking for. You know, obviously on some of our larger operations, we've got the larger liquid lagoons, especially at some of the large dairies that we deal with here in the northwest corner of the state, or some of the large hog operations. Pretty common to see these out around. Hopefully, they're well maintained. Not a lot of brush on the side, not trees. They're keeping them cleaned out and cleaned up, and all the maintenance things, management things that we want to have done. And then storage. This hoop down at the Feldon Purdue Ag Center. We were down there at the end of October, 1st of November. Field conditions must have been pretty good. You kind of think so about that time. Crops have been harvested. They've been able to get the manure cleaned out. You know, this is ready to go for winter. Be able to scrape off the lots that are there, the runways, to move the cattle around. Hopefully enough storage to make it over the winter, so we don't have to, you know, make any applications manure on frozen snow or ice covered grounds. This is what we're looking to have happen. Now, once they've done a good job of storing all that manure, how are we going to get that applied to the field? We know there's still cases, situations where we're applying it to the surface. We're running a little bit of challenge with this. You know, we've got no-till ground. Better to apply to the surface or to disturb the soil. And I think I'd like to try some low disturbance no-till injectors, but we still, some cases, apply to the surface. This picture in the top left just always entertains me. You know, I don't know if you look real close, you can see the kind of the shininess, the sheen off of manure. You know, I don't know what the application rate is there. I just know it has to be a lot to get that sort of, especially when they've covered that much ground and we're still seeing some shine there. Now it's possible that you know, we were still needing that amount of that rate could be applied based on nitrogen or soil test phosphorus or whatever, but really got to be mindful of those rates that are applied. And you know, the more we apply liquid, you know, potential gets into a crack in the soil or a crawdad hole or tile riser or something, and potential for it to be lost from sight. Obviously, bottom left there, I want to try and avoid the applications of manure to frozen and snow and ice covered ground. Need to have additional storage. It's really tough because you know, a lot of times that ground is frozen, ground is solid. It's a good time to get out there, not causing compaction. But at the same time, you know, that first melt event that comes through, if it's a slow melt, it might work okay. But if it's a fast melt with the rain or it doesn't melt at all and we get a rain on top of that, little or none of that manure will be there afterwards. We prefer to see that manure, especially the liquids, injected, sweep injector, or low disturbance, no-till injector. You know, those pictures on the right, I'd like to see a little bit more of that. We can incorporate it as well. Of course, any disturbance we have opens us up for more soil erosion and you know, degradation as far as loss of some of our soil health parameters that we're looking for as well. So delicate balance there, but trying to work all those in together. All right, switching gears a little bit to energy. I'm always looking for a little more of it, especially this time in the afternoon. But anyway, we're talking here about inefficient energy use, particularly here on the farmstead, the facilities. Most of what we're doing is just documenting what the energy costs are, estimates of each of those, diesel, electricity, and propane. If the facility, the producer already has a conservation activity plan, a CAP for their ag energy management plan, we can utilize that. Not too many of those around the state, but we do have a few. Also want to think about the field operations and if they're efficient or inefficient related to energy use. You know, obviously the more tillage that we have, the more times we're driving back and forth across that field, the more fuel that's consumed, and and less efficient. We like to see something reduced tillage, no till of some sort would all benefit. And as needed, we have the energy use index, supplemental energy tool. This is in section 3 of the field office tech guide, and where some of those other tools have been listed related to biology and pasture and some of those others. So as we need this, that's where that spreadsheet is at as well. All right, so switching gears again, talk a little bit about water quality resource concerns and whether these are at, whether that's on the farmstead or cropland. All these are off-site losses. We'll focus a little bit more on the cropland right now, but however our water moves throughout the landscape, across the soil, through the soil, wherever it ends up, whether it's in the Gulf or one of the Great Lakes or one of Indiana's reservoirs, and whatever water quality impairment is associated with it, and the sediments, pesticides, nutrients, pathogens. As that water flows, usually the nutrients, usually these water quality resource concerns, they're going to follow along with it. So, want to make sure that we keep these in mind. So one of the really cool things that happened this last year, we're trying to make lemonade out of the lemon, so we weren't able to travel this last year. So with our leftover travel budget, we bought hawk water test kits for all the field offices. So these should be getting delivered soon. We'll be giving some additional training related to the test kits and how we utilize for water quality testing. We wanted water quality testing just like we do with soil health. And do I have your attention? We didn't buy any water test kits. That would be probably fall under cruel and unusual punishment. Additionally, cruel and unusual punishment here in 2020. If you've ever used these, they are interesting. Just like a lot of the other testing we do, whether it's with COVID or not, it's kind of a snapshot in time. State regulatory agencies do use these for some of their water quality parameters and testing. Repeat, we did not purchase hawk water test kits. But we do want to think about these water quality losses. And so for us, mostly since we don't have these tests, we're just going to be trying to look at more of these visuals. And one of the first ones, off-site sediment losses. Sediment is still one of our #1 water quality impairments. But for us, as we're thinking about this, is that soil erosion? Is that sediment just being redistributed from one spot in the field to another spot, from a higher spot to a lower spot? Is it just moved within the field? Well, that's soil degradation. That erosion is still a concern, but if it hasn't left the site, we're not as concerned about it as an off-site loss. But we want to think about this in context with some of the things, hopefully, I'm pretty sure Stephanie covered, related to aggregate stability, compaction, and organic matter, and how those impact those off-site losses, and how all this ties together. If we decrease that infiltration, it increases opportunity for runoff and erosion, and carries whatever's attached to that soil particle or is dissolved in that water. So everything we can to get that raindrop to infiltrate where it lands, rather than moving off the soil, is beneficial. So we want to make sure that we're doing that. But again, just how all these resource concerns kind of tie together. But this one's in an interesting, beneficial way. So doing what we can, especially to promote those pieces of soil health, will help us impact this water quality off-site losses. But as we have increased runoff, we increase the potential for flooding. As we have more flooding, we have potential for increased bank erosion and that. So, just think about these landscapes. If we could get, there are some of these large rain events, if we could get 1 more inch of water to infiltrate the soil, how much less runoff that would be, and it would slow down the flashiness of some of our flooding. So that would help us in a water quality and a water quantity sort of way. Another resource concern is pest management and integrated pest management. This one's a little bit trickier since we don't make pesticide recommendations. We're generally not as familiar with pesticides. We don't spend as much time on this. Most cases, we've parceled this out to the farmers, industry, extension service, TSPs, whatever. But we're usually not too involved with this. At the same time, there are some things that we really ought to be thinking about as we're working with the farmers, and how all of these overlap with herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. So we're doing that interview. I kind of hate to think it was an interview, discussion, questions with a producer. Do they do scouting? Do they do any scouting at all? Do they consider economic thresholds when they're making their applications? Or is it just based on, this is what I'm applying at this time of year, or this is what the co-op, we're just spraying now because the crop is at that stage and we're spraying. I think we see it a little bit with the fungicides at times. Are they considering some of the different changes in mode of action and the different products that we're using? We know some of the challenges with seed treatments and the neonicotinoids and all of that. Variety of options with GMOs. What's their acceptance of the technologies that are available? The drift reduction, the precision, especially as we have different agrochemical herbicide products available to us. They utilize the precision technologies, the boom shutoffs, and that. Hopefully that's the case. Do they think anything different about the chemicals they're choosing? Toxicity to bees or fish, toxicity to earthworms, whatever the case might be. What are some of those observations we can have when we're out there? Do they have herbicide-resistant weeds present? We have risers and inlets? Do we have blowholes? Do we need setbacks and buffers? Do they already have those? And think about those different loss mechanisms that impact the loss of pesticides. But I would offer that as we think about conservation cropping systems and soil health management systems, that we should pay a little bit of attention to weed control and herbicide-resistant weeds. This was really challenging. One of the ways that weed scientists tells us that we might deal with herbicide-resistant weeds is to till it. We add additional tillage. We're generally not in favor of that. We're wanting to try and work with those producers to help them identify everything they can so those products they use work to the best of their ability, to make sure they understand about the spray water quality, the water quality of the spray they're using in the tank, the pH, the hardness, the nozzle selections, the timing, everything we can to make that spray to the best of its ability kill the intended targets. And that's not just weeds and with herbicides, but with any others too. So we want to make sure that we're getting full product on these weeds. We don't want to just piss them off so they produce more seed that are tougher for us to kill later. So I want to see what the existing weed control is on the farm. And I know a number of years ago, a DC had invited me out we were going to look at a CRP filter strip. There was weed control issues on the filter strip, and we went out and looked at that. And at the same time, we observed there were weed issues in every crop field that the farmer had. And so my guess was that there was some water quality issue that they weren't aware of. And this was 15, 20 years ago, before we had much herbicide resistance issues like we do today. Of course, we had some that back then, but even more so now. So it makes a difference whether it's the farmer doing the spraying or the co-op. Again, proper identification. Are we doing scouting? Are we changing up those modes of action? Different products that we're using. One, I think that's strategic here at the bottom. Are we thinking about cover crops, cereal rye in particular? Does that reduce some of the weed competition out there? And so anything we can do to knock those back would be beneficial. Along with that, as those potential for the pesticide loss, we're thinking about whether they're moving to groundwater or surface water, and assuming in almost all cases with those pesticides, there's some potential for improvement. Just trying to figure out what we can with integrated pest management and prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression, those PAM strategies, what they might do differently on those operations. Another resource concern, nutrients, nutrient management, a little bit more familiar with, especially as we've transitioned to the conservation cropping system, soil health management systems. But again, in general, we don't make these recommendations. We rely on industry or technical service providers to provide most of this. We made the decision a number of years ago, that we would be the vendor of last resort to do some of this. But we are paying more attention to this now, especially, again, related to those conservation cropping systems. We include cover crops and how we adaptively manage the nutrients, what benefits the cover crops give us, and how all of that rolls in together. And so as we're doing those, talked about nutrients and management planning, that interview, that discussion, how often, when do they soil test, how do they do it, are they doing something a little bit more intensive now than they used to? What are the 4 R's, and what pieces do they currently employ, and what pieces are they looking to make a tweak or a transition to improve our nutrient use efficiency? We want to try and capture as much of the nitrogen and phosphorus that's applied, that it goes into the crop, as possible. The more that's taken up by the crop, the less that's lost to the environment and potentially impact us water quality or downstream. Trying to do what we can with various precision technologies for those applications. Is the operation doing anything different related to some of those low yielding spots? Have they addressed those yield limiting factors? And especially up here in the northwest corner of the state, I think about those, what I would call tillage induced wetlands, those low areas where we have compaction that's happened. There's lots of tile on them, but there's compaction. Those spots drowned out, but yet we still farm them, we still plant them, we still fertilize them. And so as we fertilize them, they also catch runoff coming off the field, and those are problematic. We either fix or fire those spots, put those into some sort of wildlife or grass or something. And also just thinking about the different observations we can make out there with the nutrient deficiencies and risers and inlets and setbacks and buffers, and then the various loss mechanisms that we can have as well. And so those loss mechanisms eventually relate to nutrients transported to ground or surface water. And in all cases, I would say we can still have some improvements on those. And so we start thinking about this whole overall picture of nutrient management planning, and in most cases, we've working with technical service providers to assist us with this as we talk about these, the soil testing and how it's done, and the fertilizer recommendations, make sure that plan is developed, and implementation of the plan, and again, how we capture more of that nutrient. Can we go from a nitrogen 1.1, 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel, and how do we get that down to 0.9 or 0.8? Some real benefits there, water quality wise and air quality wise. So continually tweaking that plan and implementing that plan, making those little incremental changes. As we're making these manure applications, how do we get manure applied to more acres? If we have a high soil test phosphorus level, how do we get nutrients, manure, off of those sites and manure applied to other spots? I think we have some conservation cropping systems, soil health, that it would be interesting to get some manure at some good rates, low disturbance, on some of those sites and see what might happen. Is that a missing piece? Trying to reduce those rates, less disturbance. How do we get cover crops? Standard operating procedure on all the manure applications, especially after if we're taking silage off for dairies or beef. And then also, how do we continually improve that nutrient use efficiency, and how do we capture more of that nitrogen, that phosphorus, so we're not over applying, and utilizing these adaptive nutrient management tools pre-sedra soil nitrate test and infield testing, and all those different things. How do we utilize those and pull those all together? Thinking about pathogens, this works a lot of the same way as the nutrients, although this is a topic we've even spent less time on. But so thinking about it similarly as the nutrients, what are the 4 R's they're currently doing, especially the rate and the method of application of the manure. Does the livestock have access to the fields or water features? Hopefully it's limited access. If they do, are they controlling the leaks, the discharges, those type of things? What are those other water features, and what are those loss mechanisms for those pathogens, and for those pathogens to be transported to ground or surface water? And again, mostly the setbacks and nutrient management planning would be the ways to attempt to address those. And so we have this setback chart within the Indiana 590, the nutrient management standard, the same setbacks that we have with IDEM and State Chemist's office. And so making sure that we've put this amount of distance between the various features and the method of application. That picture on the right, if we're farming right up to the edge of the stream or ditch, we just greatly increase the chances of nutrients, pathogens, pesticides to be moved off of that field and into that ditch. So how do we get a filter strip along there? That'd be one of the preferred setback methods. Once we put that filter strip there, that's no longer annually cropped. So we're no longer annually applying nitrogen and phosphorus or pesticides in that spot. So not only is it filtering, not only is it setback, we're no longer annually making that application. So several wins there. With these pathogens, thinking about how we apply these nutrients again, difference of whether we're applying it to the surface, whether we're injecting or we're incorporating. Most cases, we want to get some manure to soil contact. Again, usually the less the better if we can get it injected below ground. A little tough with poultry or something we're applying on the surface. How would we get that done in a less disturbance way? Hopefully we could have a cover crop there as well. So winding up here, just a couple more slides, a few more slides. Additional resource concerns, some things that kind of fall through the cracks a little bit, whether it's CART or just some of our other resource concerns. But we talk about tile risers. We see lots of these in these low depressional areas here in our landscape. Again, these tillage-induced wetlands, these little pockets, that's what we have sitting out there, these risers. But this picture in the middle, I think, is one that we ought to pay a little bit more attention to. These tile blowholes or suck holes, this 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot spot. How many tons of soil loss is that? When I've done the calculations, it's over a ton, up to 1.5 tons of soil that is sucked down into the tile and comes out the tile in one of the pictures to the right. Is that soil loss included in Russell? I'm not aware that it is. But yet, it's one of those hidden soil losses. So as we have this aging infrastructure of our tile, we continually have these areas that break down and suck this, a ton of soil. All it takes, think about the Western Lake Erie Basin, and all it takes is one of those per acre or a few acres, and you start adding to the soil loss. We think we're doing a good job with controlling erosion across the surface and runoff, but yet a few of these scattered around can be real challenging and detrimental to our water quality. We've talked a little bit about air quality in the past. Mostly it's been related to greenhouse gases and various components of that, the challenges. What do we do with those? How do we handle that? And one that I think we've kind of ignored a little bit is this open burning. In particular, those items at the bottom about burning trash and chemicals and plastics and tires. You know, there are some, just because it's on a farm, doesn't mean they can burn whatever they want to. It doesn't mean it meets what's with items potential air quality concerns. We'd rather see some of that recycled or sent off to the landfill. And last but not least, how are we handling our mortality management? Hopefully they're considering those and working with those situations as well. Challenges, but with our cost share and some of our we can assist with that one as well. So with that was the last of the resource concerns I was asked to address. Are there any any questions related to those or anything similar? I'll ask again, Stephen or Brianne, are you two out there?
Yep, still here.
You know, when you get in presentation mode, I can't see anything else. So I'm hoping I just wasn't, you know, talking to myself. But anyways, if we have any questions, take them now or take them later. Other than that, that's what I had. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate your sitting in with us as we cover some of these, talked about these resource concerns, and hopefully you got some of these covered, think about some of them a little bit different way. And these are items we haven't covered a lot in the past. If we need to go into different depth or more depth on some of these, let us know and we'll attempt to do so. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Stephen. Thank you.
Oh, there is a question from Brandy Daggett that thanks. It's a lot of info. Is there any guidance worksheets that planners could use to take to the field?
Yeah, good question. You know, I think we have a little bit related to the resource concerns, but I don't think we get into all of these different things specifically. And if you have a suggestion related to that, Brandy, you know, as far as more for the farmstead or more for the field, let me know and we can see if we can put something out there on that.
Okay. Well, thanks, Tony. And thanks for everybody attending today. The recording has now ended.